Okay, everyone, welcome to Colorism Decoded. Today is going to be a very impactful discussion on the impact of colorism, bias, and how to move forward together. I'm thrilled to have such an esteemed panel to share with you guys today. Before we get into the program, we're going to go around and have a conversation. We're just going to go around and introduce everyone to you so you can get to know us a little better. But first, we want you to know this is going to be a really interactive session. We want you guys to engage with us with the Q&A, raise your hand if you have a question. This is a conversation for you. We want it to be as engaging as it is educational. So before we get started, we're going to kick it off with B.
Hi, thank you for this opportunity. My name is B. Bailey, and I am an author and professional speaker. I have been impacted by colorism over the years, and I am very excited to be able to share my insight to what I feel colorism is.
Awesome. Hello, everyone. My name is Beverly Dill, and I'm a health and wellness advocate based in San Diego, California. And I help people to tap into the self-healing power of the mind. And I believe that my life's purpose is to help others to connect to that power. I ditched a cubicle and a career of 15 plus years in favor of living a life with mindfulness. And I'm also a mother and a wife and an entrepreneur. And my husband and I have co-founded True Sentiments, LLC, where we offer products and services that promote mindfulness, health, and wellness with a cultural flavor. And I'm also a certified meditation practitioner and teacher in mindfulness meditation, neurolinguistics programming, and a couple of other meditative modalities. And I'm just excited to be a part of the conversation today.
Hi, and I'm Ronnie Cobb. I'm the Director of Recruiting, Education, and Training for the Greater Sacramento Urban League. 25 plus years in human resources, working in diversity and inclusion as well. And just excited from an former athlete standpoint, coach, and just some regional expertise in this general area, just to see how this conversation can benefit all of us, because it bleeds into so many different lanes. And just excited to be here to support Wendy today.
Thanks, Ronnie. And so I'll just round it out. My name is Wendy Allen Belleville. I started my first career in television. For 18 years, I was at Paramount Pictures and worked on several sitcoms. About 15 years ago, I transitioned to the communications, marketing, and PR industry, and I'm now the CEO of Elevate and Connect, and we support organizations looking to up-level their communications and reach their audiences. But DEI, all things DEI, whether it's topics about racism or colorism, are very close to my heart, as is everyone here on the panel. So we're really excited to bring this program to you today. So we're going to kick it off. As you guys know, we're going to start off with what is colorism? And feel free to raise your hands. Like we said, we want this to be interactive. A lot of you out there already know what this is. Some of you, I think it's a big mystery. So colorism is a discrimination within the same racial community. And by the way, we understand that colorism is not just in the Black community. This happens across all communities of color. Today, however, we're going to focus on our personal experiences. So we're going to focus on the Black community. But we would love to hear your stories if you're of a different color community, of what you experience, and we know that you do. So who here, and raise your hand if you like, but if you ever heard of the brown paper bag test, and we'll give you a moment to understand what that is. So colorism first started, it originated from, so we get some raised hands here, it originated in slavery. So the difference between racism and colorism, obviously racism is a discrimination based on people from other color groups, and they judge or discriminate based on that, on their viewpoint. But colorism is within the Black community. In this case, light skin versus dark skin. So there's a whole dichotomy between that. We have light skin, medium skin, brown skin, we come in all shades. And so there is that push and pull that has been there since the days of slavery. A lot of slaves, the lighter slaves, were usually the product of rape. And because of their lighter skin and their closer proximity to the family that enslaved them, they often worked in the house, where the darker slaves worked in the field. The brown paper bag test, it started back in those days where if you were the same color or lighter than a brown paper bag, you were considered, you could work in the house. If you were darker, you often worked in the field. But that didn't just start, it started there, but it continued on, I think, in current day, but also throughout the 20th century with a lot of Black communities and society clubs, Black fraternities and sororities, they would use the brown paper bag test, and it became this horrible, poisonous fruit of the tree of racism. And that's what we had today. And I know we have a lot of stories to share, and I'll bring it to the panel if you have anything to add to what colorism is for our audience.
Well, the other caveat I want to mention, based upon your color, you also had more access to education. If you were lighter, you assume you were probably a lot smarter. And so therefore they were willing to allow you to be educated.
Yeah, and also, I mean, you can just look at it then and now, colorism definitely plays a role in, who gets ahead and who does not.
And colorism and racism really are different sides of the same coin.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
When you talk about it amongst our own people, I think back to being from the South and how Rosa Parks was identified as a person who talked about not getting up out of her seat, when in all actuality, there was another young lady who was actually in that seat before. And I can remember the NAACP asking her not to be the representative because her skin would not identify with the audience they were trying to penetrate.
Right.
So even within our own, we were selective based on color who represented us in certain things as well. And we still do that today.
Mm-hmm. And who represented us and who would be acceptable.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Absolutely. And the term colorism, it's been around forever, but Alice Walker in 1982, and she wrote The Color Purple, she actually first coined that phrase. And so that's what we hear about today. Mm-hmm. But like we said, this is a dynamic that's been there since the dawn of time. And we're going to get into, next, we're going to focus on how and where does it show up? Because a lot of you know this, but a lot of you may not, that it's everywhere. And it's a lot of people subconsciously, they don't even realize whether you're in the Black community or the white community, any color, everyone participates in it to some degree with some bias and perception. So we're going to, I think, B, you're going to focus on like where it shows up, in the media.
Well, one of the more innocuous medias is Disney. Disney has been brought to task regarding its racism, whether it's a Song of the South and things like that. Most recently, or fairly recently, they had a Black princess, Princess Tiana, first time. However, she spent the majority of the movie as a frog, which was pretty curious. And then when it came out, they made her very, very fair. She was non-Pacific as far as being Black. And then when they had a follow-up, a movie called Wreck-It Ralph or something like that, and Disney was aware of that, they did darken the actress, made her lips bigger and her nose wider and her hair a little kinkier, made her more realistic as far as a character is concerned. But even, I mean, the colorism and that, even with the displays, if you happen to see any of the displays on the Disney princesses, Taliana is always in the back. And even when they did Pocahontas came out and she was very fair. She did not have dark olive skin. So it's everywhere. It's everywhere. In the movies, I know we talked about it before, a great movie called The Harder They Fall. It was really exciting. It was a faction on Black cowboys in the West. It was just wonderful, and it was great to see representation. However, and Wendy, correctly, is it Zazie Betts?
Yes.
Yeah, Zazie Betts. She played the role of Stagecoach Mary, and she didn't take any mess from anyone. She was hard shooting, hard drinking, whatever. But the real Stagecoach Mary did not look like this fair-skinned, beautiful, by white standards, beautiful Black woman. The real Stagecoach Mary looked more like Leslie Jones. She was big, she was dark, she looked very African. She could outshoot, outdrink any man, but they did not. And it was interesting because when I was doing my homework, the producers were Black. I mean, they missed that. I mean, they were right there, they missed that. And so it got an awful lot of flack in that regard, because it showed that only light-skinned women, or light-skinned, as some people say, light-skinned women are more desirable, and light-skinned women are more of a sex symbol than a heavy-set, dark Black woman. So when that's right in the movies, and then it's only going to stop when the lighter actresses, they also have a voice in the matter, and to push back when these roles are presented to them. So it is it's unfortunate, but that's true. Comments?
Well, I agree wholeheartedly. And I remember back in the 80s when, I don't know if those of you who remember the movie School Days, it was a Spike Lee movie. It was all about colorism. It was very triggering. And I actually went to a screening with Spike Lee in the audience, and he wanted to kind of test this. I was in college, and in colorism, it's about, they called the lighter skinned people were the wannabes and the darker skinned people were the jigaboos. That was the names, those are the names they used in the movie. And it was just about just how they were constantly at odds with each other. And the overriding messages were all in this together, let's support each other. But after the screening, he took a lot of questions from the audience, and there were just arguments and crying and yelling. It was very triggering for people. I know for myself, it brought up a lot because growing up, we went to an all black church, which we loved. And my parents were ushers and in the choir, and the children wouldn't let me sit with them in the back, and sitting in the back of the church was a fun thing, a sort of a badge of honor. All the kids did it. It was kind of fun, but they would say, well, you're not one of us. You're not black enough. You don't get to be part of us. And I never understood that because I was too black at my all white school. I was the black girl that got called all kinds of N-word names. But at church, with the black kids, and I was one of them, but I was othered. And so I never could understand that. And so when I saw the movie School Days, that really brought up a lot for me, that this is, wow, it's not just how I feel like a girl with no home, or why did some people who perhaps darker skin treat me a certain way, or why do I see, and I've had relatives who are darker skinned who were treated very poorly. It's just, we just beat up on each other. And I think it's sort of, it brings to mind the calls are coming from inside the house. You almost expect it, or you prepare and brace yourself for racism. But when it's coming from your own community, it's shocking, at least for me, and it was just very painful. So I know you guys have some other things to share, Ronnie and Beverly.
Yeah, what comes to mind for me, and I was just thinking, and we haven't touched on this, is, in terms of media and advertising, is the cosmetics industry and what we see there, where, the standard of beauty is still centered around, lighter skin, where you may see the Halle Berrys and the Rihannas and the Zendayas, but, dark skin representation falls, far between the cracks. We still see a little bit. I think we've seen a little bit in the last couple of years, but we still have a ways to go. And so, what comes to mind for me is like skin bleaching and lightening creams, because we're trying to, we see this standard of beauty, and we will go to the lengths of, skin bleaching and lightening our skin. And, it's not so prevalent in the United States because the FDA hasn't approved skin bleaching because it does have a lot of harmful ingredients. But you see that, worldwide, it's like a multi-billion-dollar industry. And you see it more so like in Japan, Africa, the Middle East and Latin America. And really it's, with men and women. And it really does stem from, them seeing it as a sign of social status and, reasons that date back to what we've talked about, kind of like, colonialism. And white supremacy as well. So that's my take on,
And to tag onto that, when I was doing my research, in that the photographic equipment, camera and film and all that are calibrated to white skin. So, there was a great episode in the show Blackish, and I do like the show, where they did the class picture, and then the little daughter, who was a nice brown skinned little girl, came out as black as can be, because the camera could not make the proper adjustment. You couldn't even see her. She was just like an ink spot. But again, the standard of excellence, the approval standards and all that happens to be a white.
When you can think back, I can think about the days of being from Tennessee, being from Jackson, Tennessee, and my mother went to integrated school at 21. So she went to school for 3 years, went to all black high schools, all black colleges, all black teachers, the mayor, all the people throughout the city, and then was selected one of two people, she and her best friend, to go to Alton, Illinois to integrate an all white school, Alton High School, and they had me. And I can remember she talked about the response they gave her about her skin color initially, for a lot of reasons. But at the same time, we talked about the first time I came home and said, "Mom, ain't I white?" And asking her, because for me as a kid, I just wanted to play with everybody. So I assumed that I was just who I was. And she said, "I remember that was one of the first times we had to talk to you about the color of your skin and how it may be viewed differently." But we moved to California in the midst of 24th and Florin, and it was all black kids. And now we had to have a whole nother conversation because now they were calling you something different and you thought you looked just like them. And so I've definitely seen it from one extreme to the other and benefited from it in the long term, but it's definitely out there and it's been there a long time, well before Madam Color Purple gave it a word. It's been
Right.
there.
Absolutely. We, and just taking a step back too, we also see colorism, it starts at home, unfortunately. There's a lot of family dynamics where this is
Absolutely.
very, very prevalent. Don't bring home some dark skinned boy, or don't bring home some dark skinned girl, or, it's a sad thing. I have so many friends where this happens to. I've seen it in my own family where parents want their grandkids to be of a certain shade. And so that, it just, unfortunately, it's a dirty little secret that we all see, and we're all on one end of it or another or in the middle, but we all have been impacted by it. But unfortunately, we're some of our biggest, the people who are creating the most dissension are sometimes our loved ones. And I think they're well-meaning when they say it. I don't think they're trying to be hurtful, but it does start at home oftentimes.
Well, sometimes they're not well-meaning. I remember growing up, I had a situation where I had a relative that was darker than I was. I mean, I can't control, what color I am, but I was light like my mother, and my father was darker. So she used to say, well, the problem with you, you're yellow like baby mess. So I never liked the color of my skin because she equated it with baby poop. And that was a close relative that did that.
Unfortunately, we see that all too often. Let's switch gears and talk about colorism and how it shows up in the workplace, because that is where a lot of, we see it a lot. And I think people outside of the Black community see it. There are studies that show that those with lighter skin, or we're talking about within the Black community or any community of color, but those with lighter skin oftentimes are hired over someone who has darker skin, but who is more qualified for the role. We see that all the time. It also, and I don't know if you guys have any experience with that or want to relate to that, but we see that all the time. And so those of you who are here with us today, who are HR leaders, who are recruiters, look at that. And is there any bias with your hiring managers or with you yourself when you're looking at candidates who are African-American? Do you lean towards, are you biased towards those who are lighter skin and against those who are darker skin? Does that, if you see someone who has lighter skin and straight hair versus someone with darker skin and braids or dreads, for example, the same qualifications, or the darker skin person is well more qualified, do you have a bias? I mean, we encourage everyone, especially as we close out the program later, everyone to check your bias and really think about, what are we all, and it's not just, people who are non-Black, what are we all thinking when we see someone who's lighter or darker coming in for an interview? Or, so I don't know if you guys want to speak a little bit about that.
Well, the other thing, they have shown and proven that darker skinned people make less money. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. This is not imaginary. The lighter you are, the more money you're going to make. You're darker, you're not going to make as much money.
Yeah. And also, I mean, we can look at just, the wage gap and unfair treatment of people of color, employees of color. I mean, that's still an issue. But then when you layer on the additional, hiring practices related to skin tone, that even, creates a further, opportunity for people of color. And so one of the examples, and you kind of mentioned it, Wendy, is that, interviewers, they are more likely to believe that, lighter skinned individuals are smarter than darker skinned individuals, even if the darker skinned individual is more qualified for that position. And then also, I found another study that showed that, all things remaining the same in terms of, race, that lighter skin, and you said the same thing, B, that, that lighter skin employees are paid more and than their darker skin counterparts. So it does continue to be something of an issue that we do need to really look to those who are in positions of decision-making positions that, are aware of colorism to make a difference, in order to make a difference in the workplace.
Absolutely.
I've had an opportunity to oversee the hiring for probably 3 of our major corporations in Sacramento, and one that covered 42 states and a part of Europe. And a part of that hiring process, and each time I've always had to add a conscious, unconscious bias segment to take all of our managers through. Back to my days at the Rayleigh's Corporation, where I wrote a book. It was going to be a 3-page pamphlet. It turned out to be a 105-page book that was called the 12 Steps to Corporate Hiring. And what it did was the managers had to successfully go through this workshop and receive my certificate before they were allowed to hire. Because my senior director, who was overall training, she felt that there was bias in a number of different categories, and we had to find a systematic way to identify these things and make sure that everyone was on the same page, at least to the point where our soft peer pressure made them think twice before making a decision that they never considered before. And it changed the entire dynamic. I remember we added Glory Foods to our shelves when I met the guy from Mississippi Catfish, because now that this was okay, we brought these sales folks in, and then all of a sudden it was like, wow, well, this is just a great product. It wasn't a great product coming from a person of color. It just became a great product after we talked about the conscious, unconscious bias. So it's been around forever, and I'm sure it'll be here forevermore.
You know, and to tag onto that, when you look at advertisement, there have been some really well-known companies like Gucci and what's the other one, and Prada. They got in big trouble because they did not have representation around the table. They came up with a really cute sweater that was a turtleneck, but you also could use it as a mask. When you pulled it up over your face, big red lips were there, big red lips. And they were just clueless about the amount of flack that they got. But again, look who's around the table. They had no color representation. If any of us were there and they came out with that particular sweater, we go, back that truck up. Let me tell you what the implications are. But again, it is incumbent upon these different businesses to look at who is around the table. If you want inclusion, you want diversity, it needs to start at home.
Absolutely.
I mean, like the Juneteenth, Walmart and Juneteenth, that was a big fat mess. I mean, they want to do something right, but they didn't have anyone around the table, which is surprising, to help steer them in the right direction. It was just a horrible mess.
Absolutely. And, you know, in the last couple of years, we've seen with the George Floyd, catastrophe, a lot of companies are in good faith really building up their, creating DEI programs. So I encourage, again, those of you who are HR leaders or CEOs, look at, continue to do the work about racism and belonging and equity, but also look at colorism. And I think that's something that gets swept under the rug or is completely bypassed altogether. People don't realize that colorism is also something that should be included in your DEI programs, because it all starts there too. It's those perceptions, those biases. And we want to make sure, one of the reasons we're doing this program today is to educate, and talking about it is one way to just kind of put it out there. And what are the perceptions, and maybe even poll some of your workforce. If you see a light-skinned woman like Halle Berry, how do you feel? If you see a darker skinned woman like Viola Davis, how do you feel? In terms of your corporate culture, does it make a difference? One thing I will say, and this is whether it's racism or colorism, no community of color wants to hear someone say, "Oh, I'm colorblind." We're colorblind. We don't want you to be colorblind at all. We just don't want to be discriminated against because of our color. And we certainly don't want to have prejudice against us if we're lighter or darker within that color community. So I think we just also want to just give that call to action to everyone who's who is a decision maker. Really look at what you can do to make a difference. I think we want to switch gears and go to
one thing, Wendy. When a person on that same line, when a person say, "I don't see color," then you don't see me.
Right.
Yes.
Right. I don't see color. No, look at me. You have to see color. You have to see things through my lens. So that's kind of a patronizing comment. I don't see color, then you don't see me.
Right. Absolutely. And let's talk about where this shows up in the justice system, because we also see this as colorism has a devastating impact there as well.
Absolutely. When you think about it in the justice system, I've been fortunate to have a brother-in-law who's the chief of police, and my stepdad was one of the first African-American sheriff deputies in Sacramento. So growing up around these conversations between HR and the justice system has been very interesting, especially as a person who writes a lot of background check and pre and post evaluations for hiring for a lot of companies. Now, what I found is that they said if you're very light, being arrested by complexion is a very high number that's very consistent nationally. The very light people are normally arrested about 40% of the time. The lighter skinned people are supposed to be arrested 44% of the time. Somewhat light, whatever that is 48% of the time. Medium is 53% of the time. Somewhat dark is 57% of the time, dark is 60% of the time, and very dark is 65% of the time. And so when you look at the justice system, even in how we've talked about how facial expressions and structures make a difference in how you're arrested. If you seem to be more simple and a more fluffy, they would say, versus a sterner face or a stronger jawline, and not as tall and not as dark, the probability of you being arrested was a lot less, which sounds sort of scary, but it's very consistent because I've sat on interview panels, and when I've asked people, why do you or not like a certain person, or even when we look at their background checks, I ask, is it a lifestyle or was it an occurrence? But a lot of times, if you were darker complected, they would assume that just must be how they are all the time. And it just wasn't the case. And thankfully, I was on those panels to help steer that in another direction. But complexion makes a complete difference in the judicial system on a regular basis.
And to tag under the complexion thing, when OJ, everyone heard the OJ case, and yes, in my opinion, he was guilty, but that's a whole nother panel. But when the news, with Newsweek and then Time Magazine came out with a cover, and what Time Magazine did, and they got a lot of flack for, they darkened him and they made him look far more aggressive. And the same picture that Newsweek did was more in keeping with his color. And it got back to the stereotype that Black men are scary, they're evil, they're brutal. They put out a 187-word apology, for it, and said basically it was just their artistic interpretation. Your artistic interpretation to make OJ, who I'm not a fan of, darker. No, that's colorism and racism on steroids.
Absolutely, because that person, the creative director, whoever made those decisions, they put their bias into it. Let's make him the scary Black man. Well, when we think of the trope, the racist trope, the scary Black man, he's not a light-skinned Black man. He's a darker skinned Black man. Right. Or the angry Black woman is typically a darker skinned Black woman and not a lighter skinned Black woman. So it's just that bias that just seeps in everywhere. Right. And so that's why we want to call it out. And this is for everyone, call it out when you see it. And those, like I said, light, medium, brown, dark brown, we're all the same. We're all the same, but it's just calling out what do we feel, and what are those emotional triggers when we see it? Mm-hmm. Anything else about the justice system we want to talk on, or any other, because this is great. We're getting a lot of great questions in. And by the way, just a quick note, we're getting some great questions in. If you guys have a question you'd like us to cover during the Q&A, which is coming up in a moment, please send it in the Q&A or the chat. How does this show up in the medical field?
I think it's probably one of the more aggressive areas. Even if you look at females and the disparities between female care of women of color, it's substantially different. I remember my Permanente days where we had a program we put in place called CARE, and that was talking about continuously and always respecting everyone. Because in our surveys, many of the women of color were saying they weren't being heard. They would come and say, I feel this way, I've had my first baby, these are some symptoms that I'm having, and people would normally diagnose them based on what they had learned in their Western cultural medicine versus their Western multicultural medicine. What we found out also is that many times that the research that was being done, based on healthy white males. And so that information was being used not only on females, but also for African-American males in the population as well. And it made it very, very difficult to comfortably diagnose how people were feeling. And so in our surveys, it would come back as, they're not hearing me, they don't care about me, this is not for people of color. And so we legitimately had to change the entire structure of how you were taken into the hospital. And then we walked the rounds with the doctors to help them hear what people were saying. I'll give you an example. There was an African-American female who was darker complected. She was probably in her 70s. She was from the South, and a young Caucasian doctor kept calling her by her first name. And so I was walking the rounds with them, because I ended up walking the rounds every morning. And as I walked the rounds with him, they came back and he said, why do you think she's non-responsive to me when I go down my charts? And I said, well, you called her by her first name. He said, well, that's her name. And I said, but she's an African-American female. She's from the South. She's in her 70s, and you're calling her by her first name. My back cringes to think if you called my mother or my aunts or my sister even by their first name if they were your elder. I said, we have to fix that. But culturally, he had no idea that there was any connectivity. And so she wanted a Black doctor, but what she wanted was a doctor who understood really who she was. Right. And once we went through some of those pieces and those processes and we readjusted our format, he was able to identify with her much better, and it got much better. But even then he said, so if she was a lighter skinned Black woman, should I still call her by her first, can I call her by her first name? I said, if she's 75 years old, absolutely not. So for him, the skin thing was a big part of it, but he thought it's because this older, darker complected Black lady was just a bitter person, his notes, not mine. And that wasn't the case whatsoever.
Well, and also they've done surveys whereby when Blacks come in to get care, if there's any kind of medicine that's going to be dispensed, they will under-medicate Blacks because they don't want it to become dope addicts, or they're going to take the medicine, they're going to sell it, whatever. And I mean, even to this day, there are some students that believe that Blacks feel less pain, you know, so consequently, you don't have to really give them more anesthetic and things like that.
So this has been an incredible conversation, guys, and I'm again thrilled to have you on the panel. We have a lot of questions now, so we're at this point, we're going to move on to our Q&A portion of today's event, and we're going to look at the first one I see is someone asking, I believe colorism happens in sports as well. I can remember watching TNT, NBA, and analysts saying Steph Curry and Klay Thompson are shooters because they can't jump. That was actually on TV. We didn't touch on colorism in sports. Let's talk about that for a moment. That's a great question. That's a great note.
Ronnie, you going to take that one?
I can tell you this, having a son that just graduated from Long Beach State and having the chance to play for a long time myself in 3 different sports, it's definitely there because it was always interesting the people that wanted to adopt athletes that were darker complected. And I'm not talking about just having them on your team. I remember specifically there were families that wanted to adopt some kids or take them to be their kids and come to their schools. And they normally picked the kids that were darker complected because they seemed to be more athletic, whatever that meant. They could, especially if it tied into football for any reason. Now, looking at basketball and baseball, it was interesting too, because I remember playing baseball and being asked by a lot of my white friends, even after having a chance to be drafted by 2 pro teams coming out of high school, they asked, you know, why do you play this sport with us when all your friends seem to be playing this other sport? And so it's one of those things where color matters because people assume that sometimes the darker the berry, the better the athlete. I've heard that specifically in college. And sometimes it was true and other times it was absolutely not true at all. I've got some cousins that are much darker than me and they're horrible athletes.
Well, and you take that, you look at advertisement, when OJ got out of the, well, I don't know if he was still playing when he was doing the Hertz commercial, he's relatively light. And that, so he was acceptable. Would they have Walter Payton, who was much darker, would they have him as an advertisement person? I don't think so.
Not running through an airport.
Not running, or
Absolutely.
running anywhere.
Another question that came in, colorism is a form of racism. However, as a society, we don't address it in our education system. Why do you think that is? It's a great question. I think it's ignorance. I think a lot of educators don't realize that colorism is even a thing. They don't, a lot of them are behind in terms of even addressing racism and inclusion and belonging. And I think it goes a long way. Look at what's taught in schools in terms of Black history. It's not, you know, accurate at all. And so I think really looking at, you know, a full scale, you know, diversity and inclusion and belonging program that includes colorism, starting with very young children, and how they can just find, you know, pride in whatever shade they are. And this, again, Black children, Asian children, Indian children, Hispanic children, any child of color, and then children who are, you know, Caucasian children, to just also, you know, see and embrace everyone, you know, regardless of the shade that they are. So I think it goes back to, and this, again, it's a great question. I think it goes back to just ignorance that colorism is a thing that needs to be addressed and needs to be discussed. I think
it's ignorance, it's also fear. If we address it, then people are going to feel bad. It's like the critical race theory. You don't want to talk about the critical race theory because people are going to feel bad. People are already feeling bad about it, particularly if you're the one that's been discriminated against. Why not have a genuine discussion about it? They've done different scientific experiments whereby they show little Black kids or little white kids a doll, and it's a white doll. What's this doll like? Well, she's funny, she's kind, but what's the Black doll like? The Black doll is mean and may take my things or whatever. Both the white kids and the Black kids said the same thing. So the Black children also were internalizing that white is better and then Black is bad. I mean, little kids, I mean, they're like in kindergarten. So, I mean, this has to be rooted out. It has to have honest discussions about this entire matter.
Right. And I'm thinking too, in terms of the education system, there is a lot of education that needs to be had in terms of colorism. And you can even look at it in terms of like disciplinary issues in terms of between lighter skinned children
Right.
and darker skinned children, where the darker skinned children are singled out mostly, and they are given far more, penalties in terms of their bad behavior and singled out than lighter skinned kids. So that is definitely something that needs to be addressed, because it does start at a young age, because kids, they I think what we have to do is we have to embrace that we're all different colors. We can't hide that. And then we have to also understand that representation is important. So in the school system, kids, all different shades of kids, have to see themselves in the curriculum. They have to see themselves so they know that they are valued. And teachers have to take that time out too as well to understand that colorism exists, racism exists. How can we start? Because it starts, in the education system at a very young age.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. We have one of our attendees, Anna Layton, raised her hand. Anna, you can speak up if you have a question. We'd love to hear from you. No, if she still has a question.
Take yourself off of mute.
Microphone. Yeah.
You're muted,
She's on
Anna,
mute.
if you'd like to say a few words. We'll just give her a moment. If not, we'll go on to the next. We have a lot more questions coming in as well. We'll leave that there for Anna and come back to her. We have another question. I'm a lighter skinned older woman at 61, and Beatrice Bailey said that it's patronizing to say you don't see color and you don't see the person. I don't want to be patronizing, but I do say that is my truth. But I've learned today to refrain from this statement. I will also say, and it's sad to say, that I have not noticed the colorism to the degree as I have learned today. I do not want to be insensitive to it. Colorism is awful. I think that's great. That's why we're doing this. We want, especially those who've never heard of it before or who didn't think too much of it. That's why we're doing this today. We want you to see it and now look at it with a different lens. And everywhere it shows up, when you're watching TV, when you're looking at ads, the newspaper, anywhere, how, when you see someone in your your work community, are you noticing that? Are you seeing are you seeing patterns, especially? So we love that. We love that question.
Okay, Anna's off of mute.
Okay, Anna, we'd love to hear from you.
Back to me, hold on. Yes, Beatrice was referencing the critical race theory. What can be done to get politicians to agree to have this taught in school? If it's not being taught at home by the parents, and it's not going to be allowed to be taught in school by the teachers, like so many things, then what is the answer? I mean, I don't know. It's just,
It's unfortunate the critical race theory has been politicized by the former administration. And it's felt that if we talk about the critical race theory, the white children will feel very uncomfortable about their past. Well, if you don't learn from the past, you're doomed to repeat it. So if the white kids, you don't want the white kids to feel bad because their ancestors bought people, slaved people, raped people, whatever. How are the Black children feeling? And for you to not to want to teach critical race theory, you're prioritizing the feelings and the perceptions of one child over another. You're so precious, you're so wonderful. We don't want your little feelings hurt, but the Black kids will have to deal with it. And you've got parents that don't want that. I saw something on Facebook that it showed Ruby Bridges going into school and people throwing stuff at her, cursing or whatever. And they said, your grandparents don't want you to know that they threw rocks at this little Black girl.
Absolutely, and wholeheartedly agree. And to Anna, to your point, it really, again, it starts with education. It starts with people, getting organized at the grassroots level. I think going out there and making their city council, their mayors, start with the smaller governments and to know, what are you doing with your constituency to bring the issue of colorism out there? How can we, what kind of educational, channels and systems can we set up to teach people about not just racism and do it correctly, and just here's the truth and here's here's what we need to do to move forward, but also colorism. And so you're right, Anna, it's prevalent. And how do people move forward? I think it starts with just acknowledging that it is a problem, just acknowledge that it exists. Make sure yourself and the people in your network are mindful of it. And if you've never paid attention to it, start paying attention to it. But in terms of what can we do just with our government, it's starting at the grassroots level. We see a lot more, a lot of activity with racism, and I'm glad for that, because affirmative action, and there's some policies that helped, that did help set some things to right, some things. But colorism needs a whole other level of awareness and education and discussion before we're going to be able to make any sense of it for those who don't understand. So I love that. Anything else you want to add, Anna?
So much of it is learned behavior. It's generational. It's handed down. We're not born that way. So there's that aspect of it. So what do we do to, get this into people's heads that basically people are people? It doesn't make any difference the color of the skin, or it shouldn't make any difference whether you're light black, tan, whatever you are. If you're Jewish, if you're whatever ethnicity.
Anna, get closer to your mic.
I'm sorry.
You need to get a little closer to your mic. We can hardly hear you.
About on top of my laptop I can't get much closer.
That's good.
And the
other thing is,
signed into here like 4 times.
You need to start your own group. Wherever you are in your own group, you need to start there. If you have questions and you have an opportunity to be with someone that is of color, you can ask some questions. Now, Lord knows we're not going to save everyone. But if you have some genuine questions and you want to respectfully ask those questions so you can educate yourself, that's just fine.
What'll happen, Anna, also, I think I commend you first and foremost for having this revelation amongst all of us that you don't know. But a big part of it, I have a big picture outside of my office, and it's a bunch of kids playing together, and they're very diverse. And when I took on my opportunity at Kaiser overseeing the diversity and inclusion programs, my mom reminded me, she said, never forget that the kids always played together until we got involved. And what that simply means, even at McClatchy High, her principal, who was Japanese and started teaching with her at the school at the same time, and they were there together for 28 years, she encouraged her to be the educator who picks out the books for the school. And she says, what I want to see is everybody in these books. So literally the books that they got for the school, she asked my mom to be the person to go identify these actual curriculum to make sure all the kids saw themselves in those books in a positive fashion. And if it was any negativity, it was equally negative throughout the book. So the biggest thing is to realize that we all do play together, Anna, like you said, until somebody tells us that we should not. What your job is now to go forward and realize there was a time you would have played with anybody, but who made you stop playing? And whoever made you stop playing, educate them and go forward, and don't be one of those people that separates us again, because with the division is where the problems come. And that's where our greatest challenge is.
Absolutely.
And also, in families, that it starts, like Wendy said, it starts with us. But in terms of in families and a family dynamic, it does start there, because that's, the children learn from the parents, right? And so I came across a book from the author is Lori Tharps, that's Tharps, and she's the author of Same Family, Different Color, Talking Colorism in the Family. And she actually identified 5 things to remember to keep colorism from infecting the family. One is don't ignore color. She says that, children can see color differences, at the age of 2 years old and younger. So it's natural and reasonable for children to notice and comment on different color hues among people in their household. Shutting down, she says that shutting down talk about skin colors sends the wrong message, saying that there's something wrong with skin colors being different. She also said, normalize differences. That means, it's important to normalize talking about, different skin tones, and be careful not to suggest that, one shade is better than the other. The third is, she said, to embrace color diverse children's media. We kind of talked about that earlier, where, color representation matters. It's important to see it in books, television shows, and other media that, kids are consuming. And then third, what we're doing today, educate yourself. She said, colorism is global, and that, parents and caregivers are, if they're to raise children that are able to successfully resist colorist thinking. They have to learn about, colorism's roots, which is in colonialism and white supremacy. And then last but not least, she talked about live your life in color. And I thought this was really good. She says, as much as possible, create social circles for yourself and your family that include people of multiple hues, making sure that children see yourself interacting and embracing different colors. And if you say, colors are beautiful and equal, but you don't live it out, you don't live out that truth, then your children will question the strength of your conviction. So those are just the 5 things. And I think that, I thought that were really good in terms of making sure that your family is, you try to not have colorism show up in your family.
I think that's powerful. Here's another question, another statement. Growing up, I honestly thought that I was better than my lighter skin counterparts. My father was a Black Panther and preached Black power. I was at freedom marches at 3 years old. Although the teachings were very biased, I think it was good for my self-esteem as a dark-skinned Black woman. Sad but true. I think that's great. I mean, I first of all, I'm glad that you had great self-esteem, and I think that's lacking for a lot of Black children, regardless of their shade. And that's a dynamic we hadn't talked about. Like, what is it? If you're a Black Panther, is there a certain assumption that you're going to be light skin versus dark skin, or dark skins? Again, that's colorism. It's pitting one against the other. Any thoughts from the panel on that? I think that was a great statement. And we also have another question. Someone said, or I believe Michael Jackson was affected by colorism, and his actions of changing his skin color greatly affected the brown and Black community. That's a great point. I know that's true. I always hear jokes, people say, oh, well, Michael Jackson used to be Black, and just, but what, and he not just only, and I know he has vitiligo too. So that's also somewhere in there. He did have that, but changing his nose and his African, features, that was a blow in a lot of ways. I know, just growing up and being a huge Michael Jackson fan, that was, it hurt. Like he year after year, he looked less and less like himself, until he was pretty much unrecognizable as his former self.
I think a big part of that too, it's really ironic. One of my mother's father lived not far from them in Gary, Indiana. So when we would go home, we would try to peek through the fence and see if we could see a glimmer of anybody, which normally we did not. But I remember the fact that I always thought it was sad that Michael was so sad in his eyes. My mom and I would talk about it all the time, no matter how he looked and how, the best performer in the history of the world, in my opinion. But the fact that his eyes always seemed sad. But if you think back to the things that he said happened to him early, and often it was just being teased about how he looked, being big nose Michael, being, bumpy skin Michael as he went through puberty, but also having enough money to change all that if he chose to, because he didn't want to be that person that they said he was. And that started indoors. That didn't start with the outside world. The outside world made fun of what he became and what he was accused of being. But the inside world was right at their house, in Indiana. So that's the sad part.
Yeah. We have someone that said Disney is one of the worst offenders. They always have the bad characters as dark or Black, and they then throw in the Barbie doll blonde with blue eyes as a victim or hero. We see that. I know we touched on that earlier with the media and how colorism shows up. Absolutely. It's those perceptions, it's that bias that, oh, how bad can we make the person look? Those are the thoughts that we want to change here. We have another question, and admittedly, this is actually from my husband. My husband, I remarried 5 years ago to a white man, and he's never, he's always been, I think, an open person, but never really understood sort of those subtleties about racism, things that I'm constantly pointing out, and certainly not colorism. And he says, I'm a white man who's married to a light-skinned Black woman. At work, I've had several Black women comment on my family pictures and ask me if my wife is Puerto Rican. When I told them she's Black, they would discount him and say she's not Black, or that doesn't count. And, it just kind of made an issue out of whatever shade that I was. And sort of like, first when he would say, oh, my wife is Black, they thought, oh, great, and these women happen to be Black, and they loved him for it. And then they saw what I look like, they said, well, yeah, she doesn't count. And if 3 of them were actually more hostile to him. Was it because of that? We don't know, but it was just a discernible difference in his experience, and he didn't know what was going on. And so, it was just something that he's starting to experience a lot. And I have a son who's brown skin, dark brown skin, and just seeing, how colorism shows up for him. Any other questions? And I know we have so many, and we're coming up to the end of our program. If there's no other questions, I just want to say, and I know we're here at the end, this has been a great conversation, so much engagement here from our audience. We're definitely going to be doing this again, and in a part 2, we may be focusing a program more on colorism, how it shows up in the workplace. We might have a program that's specific to some certain areas. But meanwhile, what we want all of you to do is you're leaving here today, we hope that you've learned something, or that this resonates with you if you already know about this. And whether you're someone who's African American or any color group, take a look, and if you're Caucasian, look at how you're showing up. Acknowledge that colorism exists, and it occurs across the races. Have the difficult conversations. We want you to have these difficult conversations with your families, with your employers, with your teammates, in your social circles. First of all, do you have diverse social circles? That's, if you don't, get started with that. Let's sort of fix that first. If you don't have a very diverse social circle, then there's a problem right there. Now, if you do, make sure that is diverse within that diversity. Identify and define words that may cause skin tone trauma, like, you're cute for a dark-skinned Black girl, or you would be cute, and I see that with in the Asian community all the time. I have nephews who are half Asian, but in the Asian community, boy, if he wasn't Asian, he's handsome for an Asian man, or what is that? Just people really look at biases in colorism, and they don't realize how much they're steeping into it. And so just being honest and taking a step back and really checking your bias. I think that's what we ask of all of you. We're not going to solve all the problems today or tomorrow, but I think if all of us collectively have a more authentic view and a transparency in how we're showing up, and if we're part of the problem, and all of us probably at some point have been part of the problem, let's lean into that and believe people. When people tell you their experiences, believe them. And when they have trauma, whether it's racism or colorism, believe them. Learn more about that. See what can you do to do better? Like Anna raised her hand and says, I learned something. Where can we learn more? So we're going to have this recorded for those who couldn't join, or those of you who want to see it again. We're definitely going to send this out. Thank you all. I'll let the panel go around and say their goodbyes, and then we'll conclude for today.
This has been wonderful, and thank you for the opportunity. And I would say anyone that is striving for enlightenment in the area of colorism, don't beat yourself up. If you didn't know, you didn't know. You know now, so you can do better. And just look at, again, as Wendy mentioned, look at your circle. Something's wrong if you have no people of color in your circle. Something's wrong. So you just need to kind of check yourself in that regard.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and also, to piggyback, it's just, education. Like we've said, that it's important that when you know better, you do better. And so just education through discussions such as this, reading more books, and just gaining an understanding of what colorism is and how it shows up. I think that we can be agents of change, definitely.
I think what I've definitely learned is that everything tastes better with a little bit of seasoning. So I would encourage you to sprinkle a little bit of everything on your lives, and you'll have better lives. And also build a bridge and get over yourself. If you find that more times than not, we're in our own way, and that's one of my favorite sayings, and I use it often, build a bridge, get over yourself, and you're gonna find it's a wonderful world to live in if we don't mess it up.
It's good.
I think I couldn't think of a better way to end this program, Ronnie. And thanks to Bea and to Beverly. You guys have been a terrific panel. Everyone, I hope you learned something. Check your LinkedIn and your Facebook. We'll be sharing this to all of you here. Thank you so much, and have a great rest of the day.
Okay, goodbye.